Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Haley McNamara. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode. I'm joined once again with Dani Pinter from the NCOSE Law Center. Dani, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to talk about the Diddy trial today.
Yes, and this is an incredibly important trial that's ongoing right now. It's obviously been getting headline news for a long time. There's a lot about this trial, I think, too, that we're going to dive into about how it, in some ways, is a litmus test for how juries and culture might understand sex trafficking and sexual abuse in general. There's a lot of themes in this case that people don't really maybe understand or think about typically. But for those who aren't really following this case, who haven't heard, Dani, could you share a little bit about the background of what is going on?
Yes, so this is a sprawling case with lots of charges, including racketeering, which is organized crime, conspiracy, Mann Act violations, which is transporting people across state lines for the purposes of prostitution, and the heart of the case is sex trafficking. And what I think is really unique about this case is you have a very famous and powerful man who the prosecution alleges used all of his businesses and his spheres of influence and even his employees to further this scheme of sex trafficking women who he was in a romantic relationship with these women. So these aren't strange women that he is kidnapping or finding, whatever. He's grooming them, developing long-term, years-long relationships, but then using his whole spheres of influence and
Mhm.
businesses to orchestrate forcing them and coercing them and to engage in some really depraved sex acts involving people in prostitution, for his own pleasure and exploitation. And he even created pornography and blackmail material from these events. So we'll dig into the details of that. But it's a sprawling case. And like Haley said, I think it'll be very good example of where we are in understanding these issues of exploitation.
There's so much to get into, everything from arson to these like, celebrity filled parties. I mean, it makes a lot of sense why this case has been grabbing headlines for so long. And for people who aren't familiar, P. Diddy, Sean Combs, American rapper, founder of Bad Boy Records. I mean, he helped launch prominent artists, including Usher and the Notorious B.I.G., all of these other artists that he's been involved with. So it makes sense also that it's headline news because celebrities just have always been around Diddy. A little bit of background on what has led up to us being here, I think, is the 2023 lawsuit from Cassie Ventura. And we're going to be talking a lot about her. She's an R&B singer, and she filed a civil suit against Diddy for rape, trafficking, and physical abuse. And that's where some people might have seen or heard allusions to a video of Diddy assaulting a woman in a hotel hallway. And that was Cassie who was assaulted. I think that the video was from 2016, but that surfaced with her lawsuit, and that case settled. But then following that, some dozens of other accusers came forward. I think that there have been actually, what I understand is there's been maybe around 70 lawsuits in total from different allegations against P. Diddy now that have stretched back to the 2000s. And then all of that kind of noise led eventually to the trial that Diddy's currently in, which started last year in the fall in 2024, which is a federal indictment, and where prosecutors are saying that he ran a trafficking operation, like you said, just a wide range of crimes from trafficking, abuse, also movement of people for purposes of prostitution across state lines, which is a federal crime. And Dani, in general, before we start digging into more particulars, I mean, for there to be a federal indictment on these issues, that usually means they have pretty good evidence, right? That doesn't
Oh,
come.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And the indictment is, full of evidence and witnesses. And, you mentioned the moving people for purpose of prostitution. That's a Mann Act violation. I mean, most of that, like, at least my observation of this trial is I mean, they're not really disputing that. Kid Cudi came to the stand and testified to the arson. And it's just interesting, all the various witnesses. The allegations against him go back from a very long time. The victims all describe a pattern of behavior. So there was repeated pattern of behavior of enlisting. He had these people working for him either as assistants, so both male and female assistants, who would work for him under, the umbrella of maybe his record label or one of his other companies. But part of their job duties would be to arrange hotels, bring large amounts of cash, even get drugs, procure drugs, sometimes using false names, which again is a federal crime, bring those to the hotel, clean up the hotel afterwards, arrange for the escorts, the prostituted persons. Almost, I think they're all male prostituted persons. And a lot of that is not really in dispute. So to your
Mhm.
point of there's got to be a lot of evidence. It's like, yes, there's a lot of evidence. And really what I'm observing Diddy's team doing is not really disputing whether there was drugs or these employees, job duties, including sort of arranging all of the sexual activity for Diddy. It's striking at the heart of the victims and trying to discredit that they were coerced or that there wasn't
Mhm.
consent. So basically, their theory of the case that I can understand is, Diddy is not a nice guy. He's got a lot of problems. He liked to party, but you as the women, you consented to it. You joined in. You wanted to do this, and they try to kind of insinuate financial gain now for testifying against him. So yeah, we can dig into that. But like I said, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence from a long period of time. I mean, even just the fact that this trial is going over a period of weeks kind of points to the amount of evidence. How many witnesses? There's so many witnesses, and so many pieces of evidence in this case.
And where it stands right now, June 12th, when we're recording and when this will air, is that the trial is still ongoing. I think now in their fifth week, and they I think that there will be more witnesses potentially, but there's a Jane Doe right now who is finishing up testifying soon. I don't know if today or the next couple days will be the end of her testimony. And then prosecution will wrap up and we'll start then having defense and closing arguments. I mean, it's going to be still a long time period
Yeah.
before the decision for this case happens, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so let's get into like what these victims are saying and how does it fit into the trafficking statute. So you mentioned Cassie. I mean, 100% Cassie's courage. And there was victims before Cassie. And what happened to Cassie went on for years, starting when she was a teenager. And now she has some distance from it. But if she had not spoken up, Diddy never would have stopped. So this Jane Doe that you're referring to, she was, describing allegations of abuse, up to a month before his arrest. So he kn
Wow.
and even within her testimony, they're talking about when he knew he was under scrutiny and still behaving this way. She was in the room when the Cassie video went public and saw Diddy's immediate reaction to that. And even after that, she has allegations of very severe violence at the hands of Diddy. So this is a person who never was going to stop. I think this is a really good example of why this justice and accountability is needed because he never would have stopped if
Mhm.
he was not arrested. He never would have stopped. So it's amazing that Cassie did that. And now she's suffering what Jane Doe's suffering, what a lot of these victims are suffering, which is really nasty harassment and attacks of her character merely for saying what she's talking, saying what she experienced, which is so unique to sex trafficking and sexual abuse victims. Because if you go to the police and say, I was robbed by this guy, they're not getting into like, well, your personal life, you do this, or how many people, like they don't start scrutinizing you as a person. They investigate, did this person rob you? But unique to sex trafficking and sexual abuse victims, if you describe abuse and you merely just want to report abuse, which at the end of the day, let the process play out and maybe they'll be found guilty, maybe they won't. But that part of the strategy is to dissect you as a person, I think is really is really a big flaw in the system. I mean, it's partly why we still have a long way to go and why people don't come forward and why we don't see accountability. Because Sean Combs did what a lot of predators do, which is he established a very, very, very strong personal and emotional and romantic relationship with these women, and then got them to do things that would be so embarrassing and shameful. Again, like they don't want to talk about it, and of course they are being shamed for it. And then everyone's just
Mhm.
saying, "Well, you stayed with them," right? So that is the heart of this case. Like what happens with this case will determine how far we've come in understanding that you can be coerced by even someone you think you love, which as you and I know, Haley, the most common form of sex trafficking is the romance lover boy sex trafficking, where even in minor trafficking, the trafficker begins the grooming process by establishing a romantic relationship.
Yes, and I think there's multiple things here. I think that the public in general maybe doesn't understand about sex trafficking, and number 1 being that grooming and coercion doesn't have to always look like physical violence, and like you've said, the defense, it seems, has really focused on arguments like forcing these women to read out a loving text message that at one point they sent to Diddy. I think that that's happened a couple of times, and they'll say, "See, isn't this evidence that you were just willingly engaging in everything and there was never abuse or non or sexual abuse in that relationship?" And it's so fascinating that this is still allowed to be an argument, or an argument that's taken seriously around sex trafficking, when we already have the example and some understanding on a societal level, that domestic abuse exists, and that women, like, I feel like we as a society have evolved to at least less often ask, "Well, why did she stay?" Well, she said that she loved him on his birthday, and then the next day complains when she got beaten up. And people understand with domestic violence that there is a romantic relationship that then can be abused, and that there's a psychological tie between the victim and the abuser, that someone can believe that they're in love with the person who's abusing them, and that that person can even defend that person to the police, can return to that person after abuse has happened. I feel like we understand that with domestic violence better, not perfectly, but when it comes to sex trafficking, people are thinking, well, you were willingly participating this night, so that must mean that you were for all time, completely consenting.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I would say we're sort of on a spectrum. Like I actually think we don't understand that even the domestic violence context to the
Mm,
point that we should. I think we've come so it's like I think we've come further with domestic violence and understanding those dynamics than we have with sex trafficking, because I think if you started saying what you're saying, people would it would recall memories to them of education they've had on domestic violence, because I would say the general public does have some awareness of domestic violence talking points, and that would maybe recall. But, we've heard a lot of stories from victims of domestic violence. Even in I have some friends who try to get, like, restraining orders and things for women for domestic violence. It's still really, 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 really hard.
mm,
And judges still don't get it. And it's not till like the woman is murdered, right? We see those headlines where she tried a million times, she told a million people, and it isn't until she's killed that everyone's like, oh yeah, like he definitely was abused. So I think we
mm,
still actually have a long way to go to still understand that loving relationship can include abuse, and that the victim tolerating abuse doesn't mean that she isn't experiencing abuse. I think we at least have a slight understanding in domestic violence. I think we have no understanding in sex trafficking. What I find interesting that we seem to get is in the context of cult dynamics.
mm,
Everybody knows that in a cult, you are going to be forced to do all kinds of things against your own interests. And that at the heart of that is love and admiration for the cult leader. And
mhm,
nobody questions whether those people are victims.
mhm,
Now I don't know the dynamics of, like it probably is still hard to charge a cult leader with crimes, so that's interesting, but I think from a psychological perspective, nobody disputes that. No one thinks, like, the people at the Jones Day cult that drank the Kool-Aid and died, no one doubts that they were victims. No one would say, like, "Well, they chose it." I mean, everyone understands that there's a blackmail, manipulated exploitation there wrapped up in in love and admiration. And that is the same dynamic at play both in domestic violence, but even more so in trafficking. Because oftentimes in domestic violence, this is an abusive person and the nature of the relationship is romantic, which is what makes it domestic violence. There's oftentimes there's these narcissistic personalities who definitely plan out and scheme abuse, but sometimes they're just an abusive person and they're going to abuse anybody in their sphere. But with sex traffickers, we see a very intentional pattern of behavior where they seek out a particular victim. They, like clockwork, do certain intentional things to gain their trust, to create the semblance of a romantic relationship that is completely disingenuous on the part of the trafficker, and then to slowly introduce the things they actually want to get from the person, and then repeatedly to love bomb, use affection to buy back trust after, inflicting horrible abuse. And then that actually creates a cycle of intense bonding because when you go through a trauma with someone, for example, if you go to war with someone or you experience a car accident or like a shooting or something, if that height state of emotion, if you experience with someone, actually creates a psychological bond. And that is
Mm,
what a loop that the trafficker will do, where they're the one inflicting the trauma, but then they are also the person providing the comfort, and that creates almost like a physiological and psychological like connection that's very hard to break, a bond that's very hard to break. And then that's what we saw with in this in the at least that's what I'm observing in the testimony of these victims. And I do want to just talk about what is sex trafficking, because I think the other problem with this
yeah.
case is people don't actually know what sex trafficking is at all. So I was on Nancy Grace and a defense attorney after harrowing testimony from Jane Doe. So no cross examination yet, this is just her story, and it was horrifying. And his response was, I think he was great witness for the I think she was a great witness for the defense. I mean, she described some horrible stuff, but that's not sex trafficking. Real sex trafficking victims don't like rub their traffickers' feet. It's like, wow,
Wow.
like actually they do. They
Mm,
really do. They almost always think they're in love with their trafficker. Literally, the days of, unless you're in a different country, but if we're talking about United States domestic sex trafficking, the days of like guerrilla, intensely violent sex trafficking has gone way down. That exists in very particular contexts of like street gang violence for sure. But most of the time, it is this romance model, almost
mhm.
all the time.
Like, if you're a sex trafficker, it is so much better to have a woman who is emotionally aligned with you and feels loyal to you than that can go out and go to the grocery store, and you're not worried that she's going to scream for help
Exactly.
because she's psychologically bound to you. That's so much easier, I would imagine, if you're a
Easier.
trafficker. Yeah.
Exactly, easier, and unfortunately, there's not a small pool of vulnerable women who are susceptible to this, and they're very good identifying women in need who are
Mhm.
also, seeking love, and that's basically the magic potion, right? For Cassie, she had these dreams of becoming a star, and she's connected with one of the most powerful people in the industry, and she was a very young woman from a vulnerable situation who was also seeking love. So he provided her the answer to her dreams, and he provided her the love that was almost impossible to extricate herself from. And
Mhm.
we see him doing that a time and time again of providing people what they needed and then using different strategies of like blackmail and coercion
Mhm.
to then force compliance. But in the back of their head too is, well, I also would like lose my job, lose this, lose that. So I want to get into some of the details of this. So trafficking, people think trafficking. I've had people comment, isn't trafficking, taking people from one country to another? No, that's human smuggling. Trafficking is in the United States federal law and under the Palermo Protocol, which governs most of Europe. Trafficking is very, very broad, intentionally by design, to encompass using force, fraud, or coercion to cause someone to engage in commercial sex, which is a broad term that is exactly what it is. Any kind of sex act that's commercialized that involves the flow of money is going to
Or
be
things of value,
wrapped.
so it could include food or drugs,
Yeah, anything
right?
of value, food, drugs, or the pornography. I mean, if you're
Mhm.
creating pornography as part of the sex act, you now have something you could sell or trade. That's something of value. So, exactly. Every bit of that statute is very broad intentionally. And so that's the question here. Did Sean Combs use force, fraud, or coercion to cause these women to engage in commercial sex? Every single one of these freak offs involved paid prostituted men. So pretty easy to satisfy the commercial element. Every single one of these freak offs, even though they involved his girlfriend, also involved paying not only the prostituted persons, but also everyone involved that of his employees that he would have come set up and arrange drugs, the hotel, cover ups, blackmailing people, paying people off after the fact. I mean, myriad crimes involved in just setting these things up, but it always involved that commercial element. So, yes, it was commercial. So now the only real question is, did it involve force, fraud, or coercion? And I think this gets to what you were talking about, Haley, is like people think it could only be physical violence. Yeah, there was physical violence
There was
involved, but it's
physical
not like
violence,
that
yeah.
was there absolutely was, but it's not like it was a feature of every single interaction. But each time something happened, that's theoretically a violation of the law, right? And these things went over for years. So maybe in some instances, well, in some instances there was. And in one instance, for example, Jane Doe describes running from him as he kicks down a door. So she hides in the bathroom. He kicks down that door. She hides in a closet. He kicks down that door. He beats her bad, beats her so terribly. She runs out of the house, hides for 2 hours, comes back, goes in the shower. He hits her again, beats her again, and then forces her to take drugs, and then they do one of these. I don't know how anyone can dispute that that incident alone was conducted under
Mhm,
force. So to me, he could be convicted just for that incident alone.
mhm,
But if we want to talk about all of this over the period of time, let's get into coercion. So under the statute, coercion is defined as a pattern or scheme that causes the victim to believe that if they didn't comply, they would suffer serious harm. And serious harm could be not only physical harm, but also financial harm or reputational harm.
mm,
So in Cassie's case, he controlled every aspect of her career. So we heard testimony from victims that he controlled what she wore. He controlled every meeting she took. If she got the opportunity to do something, it was only if he agreed. Like she had no
mhm,
freedom to like go out and record a song or release a song without him. So creating that system, even if he didn't directly say, if you don't do this, I'm going to nix all this, I think there's a very strong evidence that she would believe that if she didn't comply with him, that all of that would go away, which I would say is financial harm. But then there's the kicker that he recorded every single one of these and
yes.
routinely threatened to release them, routinely
Mhm,
threatened to release the sex tapes, which is not only straight up blackmail and extortion, but that's reputational harm. So right
yeah,
there, if she can't say no without threatening reputational harm, that's coercion. And we saw that with Jane
mhm.
Doe too.
And I think that's a piece that, at least in what I have seen, has gotten lost a lot. The fact that he filmed what was reportedly rape in, like, cases of paying what was reported as paying prostituted men to rape women, and then filming that, watching it personally, but also using it as blackmail, or which could be like a form of sextortion, image-based sexual abuse, certainly. And I think that too is a really common tactic, that it doesn't leave fingerprints, it doesn't leave a bruise, but that is absolutely the definition of coercion. I've talked to teenagers who were sex trafficked, and that exact scenario kept them in their abusive situation. This happens every day, that kind of thing alone. Again, if you don't count the control over the career, if you don't count the romantic grooming that happens, but even just that abuse of those images is absolutely a form of coercion.
Yeah, exactly. So
Mhm,
and I kind of see it all stacking up. It's like he created this very intense emotional relationship which the women were in love with. I mean, clearly he's one of the most famous beloved men in the world. He has charisma, he has charm, and he was famous and powerful at the time. These women were desperately in love with him and eager for his attention and his approval. So he did inflict a lot of emotional and psychological abuse on them. Like they're you could see both in Cassie and Jane Doe's testimony, and it sometimes even said explicitly, like their self-esteem was wrapped up in Diddy's treatment of them. And so
yeah.
he would, either lavish them with praise and uplift them or tear them completely down. And so I think that psychological abuse alone could qualify as coercion. And then if
Mm,
it's like, well, if they got the courage to move past that and start to say no anyway, then he would start hinting, and he really did. Particularly Jane Doe, he would say things like, "Well, okay, I mean, you don't have to do this anymore. Like, if you're not into it, I totally get it, but I'm not going to pay for the apartment of someone I'm not like dating and who's not doing her job." So he's
Mhm.
hinting now, like, I'm going to take away the financial assistance that you've become dependent on, right? And he created that system. Like
Yeah, he said
he offered to pay her rent so that she could always be available to him. But now she doesn't have a job. And if he takes it away, she's immediately housing insecure and she had a child. So he
yeah.
created a situation where she depended on him financially and then he could take it away. And then if that didn't work, he would threaten the tapes, and he did to both of them. To Jane Doe too, he said he even threatened to send the tapes to the father of her child, which caused
Wow.
her such distress that she said she was contemplating suicide. And so then if that didn't work, then he would resort to physical violence.
Yeah, layers and layers of coercion. And I think one other aspect of this case that is kind of disheartening to see. I mean, I know defense lawyers that are going to do everything they can for their client, but is a lot of, I mean, which I just don't know another word other than victim shaming, and just this idea of, well, are they a perfect victim? And if they're not a perfect victim, then they weren't abused. So, for example, they've made them, I said before, read texts saying about how they loved Diddy, etc. But they also made them read, multiple of them read texts that were very sexually explicit in nature and talking about their sex life and framing it as like, well, these women, I think even like the fact that they had financial or career dependence on Diddy, whether explicitly done or just implicitly, is oft also used against them. Like, well, are they just gold diggers? Are they just looking for a free ride from this guy? And not recognizing that that is part of a tactic of an abuser, is to isolate a person and to set themselves up as the sole source of whether you're an occult truth or an abusive or trafficking relationship, love and acceptance. But I think that it's still disheartening to see that happening, because I just would wish that we would be beyond that in a way, but we're
Well,
not.
and it's like, yeah, of course the defense attorneys are going to do it. That's their job. But when the media seems to
Yeah.
kind of be confused by it as well, right? Like that's kind of a temperature check. And that's why I'll be very fascinated to see what the jury does here. Like, are they going to get it or are they going to have that same confusion? And that's all the defense's job is to create confusion, to create doubt. And yeah, I think we haven't come far enough if you could confuse a jury or the media or the public that if, for example, because Jane Doe ended up doing OnlyFans at one point, like if she did OnlyFans, then she can't be hurt. You know, because she's saying, she's like, I never want to do that. I never wanted to do it. The only reason I did it was to please Diddy. And then at some point, because I was literally afraid of him. So
Mhm.
to think that like we can almost create doubt in someone's mind that they didn't want to do it when they're saying they didn't want to do it.
When they're saying they didn't want to do it.
Because
Mhm.
of things in their personal life, I think that's the heart of the problem, right? And and
Yeah.
and and even both Cassie and her telling Diddy they didn't wanna do it. And but the defense attorney is actually saying, "Okay, you said you didn't wanna do it, but actually you did because you're
And there
XYZ
were
slut shamed."
witnesses. I mean, I think Kathy's, like,
Mhm.
stylist testified that he told her that she was being forced to go to freak-offs, that she didn't want to. Like, there's other people too, but still there's the ability to plant this seed of doubt, like you said, in a jury's mind that, well, she said she didn't want to multiple times, but did she maybe because she isn't a perfect victim and I don't even like that phrase, but maybe she sent an explicit image to someone and then therefore she
Well,
can't be
and like
harmed.
the yeah, and the truth is, I mean, there's a couple things. Truth is, traffickers target vulnerable people on purpose. So victims of sex crimes often have a history of sexual abuse and even potentially a history of like a very active sex life, however you want to say that. That's
Mhm,
part of what attracts the trafficker to them. So then to suggest that that history actually undermines their credibility as a witness of a sex crime is just wrongheaded. It's just
mhm.
wrong. In fact, it should help prove that they are most likely a victim of sex trafficking, if it does anything. But that's kind of like the heart of the issue. And I think the prosecution is doing a really good job. So I'm hopeful the jury's going to come out right on this. But it's interesting you brought up that the makeup artist, the stylist, who is Cassie's friend, because he talks about witnessing terrible violence against Cassie and saying like, I always thought that he was bad for her. I tried to set her up with the people I thought he was bad, and he got terribly threatened by Diddy and like experienced violence and being like scared to death of
Mm.
Diddy. But then he's still like, yeah, but I mean, I love him. I love him. I wish him the best. And it's like that should prove I don't know. I'm so curious. I mean, to me, that proves what all these women are saying is true. He also both is wrapped up in the charisma of Diddy and having an emotional attachment to Diddy and an admiration for his career success, while also
Mm,
saying, like, yeah, he was crazy violent to me and he threatened me. Does that mean he didn't threaten him? Do
mhm.
we disbelieve that he was threatened and afraid because he also has love and admiration? Because if we don't, because it was extremely credible in my opinion, then we should have the same view of the women. Like, they both loved and admired him, but they also experienced terrible violence and abuse and were coerced to do things they did not want to do. And Diddy
Mhm.
knew they didn't want to do them.
Absolutely. Well, I know that we're running out of time for today's episode, but any last thoughts, Dani, on this? I think this is a good exploration of just some of these themes, and like you've said before, this will just be in some ways a litmus test on where society is now, where juries are now in their ability to understand some of the nuances in this case. But any parting thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'm just astounded by the courage again of Cassie and some of the other victims to share their story. Even some of them, they were brought under subpoena. They maybe didn't want to, but they still are getting into some really hard facts. And that takes incredible courage. So I hope at the end, justice is seen for all of that pain. And I think that's what everyone, too, can take away from this, that accusing a powerful person of a sex crime is not an easy paycheck. In fact, it's a grueling and traumatizing experience.
Mhm.
And to do that is one of the worst things I'll ever experience outside of the abuse. So it's not an easy meal ticket. It's not an easy paycheck. So they're really suffering. And so I hope we can all keep them in our hearts and minds and be generous to them as we hope the justice plays out, system plays out rightly.
Great. Thank you so much, Dani. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. We really appreciate subscriptions, especially over on our audio. You can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And thank you all so much for joining us in Ending Sexploitation.